Kia ora, guys. Thanks for coming along. We'll start in about a minute once we've given an opportunity for everybody to come into the webinar. Right. We might get underway, given it is 11 o'clock on my computer. Okay, kia ora. Good morning. Thank you for coming along to this webinar focusing on the new legislation associated with process heat emission devices. My name is Jeff Smith. I'm one of the directors here at Deta Consulting, and I'm pleased to have some partners of ours, PDP, joining us for this session today to get into the weeds a little bit around the new consenting requirements, answer some of your questions that you may have around the new guidance. But before we get into that, I was just going to give a bit of a framing piece around the role that the guidance has, as well as some of the activity that's been going on around process heat decarbonisation over the last short period of time. So I guess this, for me, or for us, is one of the first sticks that's really coming into play around enforcing the movement towards a decarbonised industry. We've been lucky enough, fortunate enough, industry has had the ability, I guess, to utilise carrots in the past. Two specific carrots I'll call out to. One is clearly the Giddy Fund. For the last sort of 5 odd years, industry has had the ability to access capital funding to change the economics on the business case for decarbonising their sites. That was administered by ECA, and the other piece that has been available for quite a long period of time and continues to be available is the support from ECA to help determine and develop energy efficiency projects, as well as decarbonisation roadmaps for industry, and understand kind of what that how looks like. The new consent requirement really is moving away from, I'm going to call it the local airshed, and focusing on those sort of more particulate type emissions, and moving towards a larger airshed and the CO2 impacts that may have. And I guess for clarity, there are a number of organisations that currently do not have consents that will be called up in this legislation. But for those organisations that do have existing consents, this legislation will not require a new consent. We can wait till that consent expires before we roll on to the next one. Look, that all being said, I'd like to introduce the panellists today, if I may. So from PDP, I'm really pleased that Tess Druitt and Deborah Ryan can join us. Thank you guys for joining us today. And just for clarity, Tess was involved in the creation of this legislation, so I'm sure she'll be able to shed some light on the process that they went through there. And from the Deta team, we have Luke Rundle, who runs, and I guess is our expert from the process side, and then Dave Taylor, who is our expert from an emissions roadmap standpoint. So pleased to be here. I'm going to jump first, if I may, to you, Tess and Deborah. So in the new legislation, there's lots of TLAs, three-letter acronyms. Wonder if you can just help us understand what they mean and how they kind of connect into each other initially. Thank you.
I'll just start by just clarifying that I didn't write the legislation. I worked with ECA to write the guidance document. So we did a lot of work on interpreting some of the terms in the legislation, and it is quite complex and it is quite difficult to get your head around. So yeah, I worked with the team at ECA and we put together quite a good comprehensive guidance. So hopefully everyone's got a copy of that. But I just put a couple of terms down that I thought it would be worth just kind of starting with. Not noting that we've got people with varying degrees of background and understanding on the Resource Management Act here. So obviously we've got the RMA, which is the overarching resource management legislation in New Zealand, and that manages all sorts of activities and their effects on the environment, including discharges to air. And so as part of that, regional councils' functions are to manage discharges to air, and they do that through their regional policy statements and their regional plans, which kind of set out the requirements for resource consent. So a lot of these types of devices traditionally might not be covered within the regional plans. It might be a permitted activity not requiring resource consent, but also, as well as regional plans, the government can set national direction for certain issues, and one of those issues is obviously greenhouse gas emissions. So for industrial process heat, what the government has decided to do is they've established the National Environmental Standard for greenhouse gas emissions from industrial process heat, which is the NES GHG. That is essentially an RMA regulation which sets national standards for managing greenhouse gas emissions. And then the NPS, greenhouse gas industrial heat, is kind of the supporting policy framework. So yeah, that was prepared by MFE. ECA, as I've said, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority has done a really good job at putting together some non-statutory guidance. And you'll also hear us talk a lot about emissions plans, which, if you require consent under the NES, you need to prepare an emissions plan. And for high emission sites, that needs to be reviewed by a suitably qualified person. And a key component of the emissions plan is the BPO, which is where you really need to show that your device is, and that as part of your emissions plan to reduce emissions, that you're doing the best practical option to prevent or minimize greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's probably a good point to start, is just getting all of those terms out of the way.
I was muted there. Thanks, Tess. No, good to understand that. And again, for those people on the call who are perhaps a little less technical, good to have that background and understand that link to both local body as well as that national directive piece. Maybe if we just stay with Tess, you and Deborah for a moment. So who's really going to be impacted most by this? You talked a bit around permitted activities, and I kind of alluded to that in my intro as well. So maybe could you give a bit of an overview of the particular maybe fuels that could be affected most by this, or sectors, or maybe type of technologies?
Oh, yeah, I was going to cover some of that off, Jeff. Kia ora tātou. What type of fuels are captured? It applies to any carbon-based fuel from fossil hydrocarbon origin. So that it includes the standard sort of coal, LPG, natural gas, and oil, but it does actually also include waste oil, plastics, and tyres, sort of things that are derived from fossil fuels. So, but it does not capture CO2 emissions from the likes of biomass, wood-derived fuels, or biogas. And then moving on to the types of devices that it applies to. It applies to heat devices that are kind of used for manufacturing of or processing of raw materials. And it includes heating for growing plants. So those are boilers, furnaces, and engines. It excludes devices that have got the main purpose to generate or transmit electricity, so it would exclude generators on site. It includes backup devices, which are devices that operate less than 400 hours per year, and also excluded are what is defined as a low emissions site. A low emissions site is one that, so there's a threshold in the National Environmental Standards rule framework that has 500 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And so above that, a greenhouse gas consent is now required where you're using fossil fuels emitting above that. And obviously, if you're below that, you're not captured by this regulation at this point. So I just thought I'd give an example of a device, say a natural gas boiler, and sort of the threshold of activity that might be captured by this. If you are operating a gas boiler sort of 24/7, you could be caught by this legislation or regulation if you're, say, 290 kilowatt device. So quite a small device compared to what might be required for an air discharge consent. Some regions have air discharge consents as permitted activities up to 10 megawatts. It usually varies by fuel. But if you're less than that, you won't necessarily have been involved in a consent process before. And potentially, you could be. Just conversely, if you're operating that same boiler 8 hours per day, 5 days per week, then you could have a device that's up to 1.2 megawatts and not be captured. So the actual requirement for consent is based on the annual fuel consumption and the calculation of CO2 based on that, and obviously the calorific value of the various fuels.
Cool. Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, and I think that it's interesting to touch on that for a moment, because that you're right, the operating parameters are really, really important here, and as well as the type of fuel, clearly, and reflecting a little bit on the last 5 years of Giddy has also been around the amount of impact that you can have from a carbon perspective, and lots of coal has been abated. So clearly coal is a higher carbon fuel. Will be more impacted, perhaps, in this case, assuming that the asset didn't have to have a consent anyway. Can we jump ahead a little bit? Luke, perhaps I'll jump to you. Deborah sort of outlined some of those end users, or those industrial process heat users who may not have been through the process before. What's the process to getting a consent through this legislation?
Yeah, excellent. So I mean, it's actually not the most complicated process, to be honest. From our perspective, number one thing is understand kind of your fuel usage on site and your current consent conditions. So as Deborah alluded to, there's some kind of limits around fuel. So once you understand, hey, this applies to me, great. And do I have an existing air discharge consent? No. Okay, then kind of you move to the next stage of the process. And for us, it's kind of setting up a bit of a plan and understanding really early about kind of what emissions reduction looks like for your site. So engaging with experts like PDP or Deta or others in the industry is really important up front to understand, hey, this is where we are, this is where we want to go. So that when you go and then kind of you frame that up, and then kind of our next step we really recommend is engaging with the council nice and early. So that kind of pre-application meeting with the council, your local regional council, is really important to tell the right story. So help them understand, for many councils, this is pretty new legislation, as it is new for industry, right? So they don't deal with a lot of decarbonisation, that kind of side of things. So taking them through, hey, this is kind of what our process does. This is the opportunities we think we're going to find in our emissions reduction plan. Really helps set the tone for kind of what your end result is going to be. So once you kind of understand, does this apply to you? Do I have current consent? What's the story to the council? It's then actually jumping into the meat of this, which is setting up an emissions reduction plan. So you start off with looking at site opportunities. So saying, hey, this is my industry, this is what I can do on the supply side, i.e. how I produce heat on site, this is what I can do on the demand side, how I use the heat, and then saying, actually, this is the best practical option for my site. Basically, if I was to decarbonise with a logical hat on, or with a financial hat on, or with consideration of all other factors on site, this is what I should do. What you do is you present that plan to the council saying, look, we've looked at all our stuff, we've got experts involved, they think they agree with us, or this is their plan, and this is our pathway to reduced emissions. And that's called the best practical option. This sets reduction targets over the length of your consent, so 10 years for existing boilers, some 20 years for new boilers, if the council agrees with your plan. And then what you do is you take it from there, we work with PDP, or you work with your planner to say, frame up the consent to the council, produce your emissions reduction plan, submit it, and then you get underway and actually implement those. So that's one of the really important things about this legislation compared to, say, decarbonisation plans industry have done previously, which is actually the stuff you put in this plan, you have to do. It's part of your consent, it's part of your continued operations boiler, and you'll have reduction targets you have to report onto the council as part of your continued operation.
Okay. Thanks, Luke. Can I just ask a little more, like there seems to be a lot more trust with this consent process than perhaps other consent processes. I built a house a while ago and I had a number of people that came and checked and made sure things were being done appropriately. Maybe between you and maybe some input from Deborah and Tess as well, like what's everyone's role here? It feels like the SQP has a bit of a larger role to play than perhaps other consent processes, and is that the case here?
Yeah. From our perspective, I think I mean, Deta's role within this is quite solid for us. We developed the emissions reduction plan. So we're decarb people. We've always been decarb people for the last 10, 12 years in this industry. So we understand what industries and what opportunities they have. ECA's also pulled together some great guidance documents around options in industry, some industry-wide papers. So you kind of pull from all that and you create that plan. So that's Deta's role. Within that, I think Deborah and Tess alluded to, if you're above 2,000 tonnes, you have to have this approved by an SQP. An SQP, suitability qualified person, is someone like Deta. There is going to be some training by CEP, and CEP is going to run, so Carbon Energy Professionals, which is our kind of industry body, will have a training kind of framework for that. Currently, it's not set up. So effectively, it's people with 10 plus years experience in this field. So yeah, that's what an SQP does. In terms of PDP's role, Tess, and kind of how that works versus the council works, would you like to take that away?
Yeah, well, PDP, we're an environmental consultancy. So we have planners and we have all the other kind of technical environmental specialists. But as planners, our role is really to establish the consenting requirements and assess the effects of an activity under the RMA and present that as a resource consent application. So in the planning space that I work, we rely quite heavily on the technical experts to prepare really good quality technical reports. So in a situation like this, if someone's prepared the emissions plan, we need to then do all the RMA stuff that goes behind that. And that's kind of meeting with the councils, preparing the assessment of environmental effects, preparing draft conditions, all that kind of stuff to support the resource consent application.
Thanks, guys. I think that, sorry, Deborah, as you were.
I was just going to add to that and just say, so we've got that sort of, with our firm of scientists and engineers and planners, we've kind of got that wider ability to do investigation and feasibility around the consenting risks. So if you're kind of looking at options under the NES for process heat for, different types of replacement for your current fossil fuel system, then we're able to kind of do that supporting role of geotechnical assessments, looking at the wastewater, contaminated land. There could be asbestos removal associated with, deconstructing an old system and putting in something new. We can do climate risk scenario stuff. So it's really we can kind of do that feasibility consenting risk around the optioneering, so that because that kind of feeds into whether there's something financially viable, which is one of the things that you need to kind of establish under the regulations, is that this is actually feasible and viable. So you may need more information about some of those environmental aspects to be able to make a decision on what the right option is for your site. So we can also look at any land use planning requirements and seeing if there's compliance issues around that kind of thing. So it's kind of a supporting role into the overall consenting that might be, so you might be triggered by the greenhouse gas consent, but you might have a lot of other considerations for a particular site. So PDP can take that
Thanks, guys. No, that's clear. So I guess we've talked a bit about this emissions plan, and the fact that we're going to have some opportunities potentially that we roll into a consent. But maybe can I throw to you, Dave? Can you tell us a bit more about what this emissions reduction plan actually is, what sort of stuff's in there? And just touching on what Deborah talked about there around viability, maybe some of the pieces, or describing the viable aspects, which perhaps alongside perhaps the less viable parts as well, which I think is worth touching on.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, there's actually quite a few different parts to the emissions plan. And the first part really is around, I guess, a site-wide look at the energy efficiency. So the requirement is to do an energy audit on the facility. So really looking at that, the demand side. So really looking at that demand side first, looking at things like lowering temperatures, flows, scheduling, process changes, those kind of things to make sure that the site is running as good as it possibly can. As part of that comes into as well as the heat recovery. So lots of sites have the opportunity to recover heat from, say, the refrigeration system. So even though I guess the refrigeration system isn't typically part of that process heat, it still needs to be rolled in as a source of heat. That's typically the first, the first document, and that will come out with a range of options. The second document is what we would typically call an emissions plan that we'll prepare. And that takes some of that base use of the site after all those so the demand reductions, and say, this is your requirement for heat. It looks at a business as usual kind of scenario, which, for an existing site would typically, be the gas boiler or whatever, and compare that against various other options such as biomass boilers, high temperature heat pumps, and electrode boilers. So go through, would look at all of those, because I guess until you actually do that investigation, often you don't know how the economics is going to work out. So we'd look at all of those and come up with the capital and operating costs and everything. And that would have a suite of, I guess, options at the end of it. And the final part of that really is typically what the councils are calling an actual emissions plan. So that emissions plan has to come on a letterhead from the client. It really is therefore saying, yes, we are going to do this. And as part of that document, it might only be a couple of pages. It would be saying, we're going to be doing these 4 things from the energy audit, and this is our recommended pathway on the boiler side of things. And one of the big overlaying things around that is, I guess, the feasibility of it. So it has to be technically feasible. So you're not going to be made to put in a really, really expensive solution which doesn't pay off just to reduce carbon. It really does have that economic side to it as well, but also technical side too. So it needs to be tried and true and actually feasible options to have that put in.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, no, I don't think the legislation isn't looking to to roll out utopian solutions. I think it's I'm going to call it a helpful step change in the right direction for industry. Can I go back, Deborah? You talked a little bit about risks earlier on and consenting risks, but one of the risks that we've heard as we've started to engage a little more with our customers has been the risk of this legislation being repealed. I don't know who I'm going to throw to in particular if anyone wants to jump in and comment on this, but is there, do we see this as being sticky long term? What is the real risk of this being repealed, given we've had a government change over the last 6 months or so?
Yeah, I think that it's a sort of a million-dollar question at the moment. We haven't heard anything that there's it's on the agenda for the government. So at this stage, we're not expecting any repeals. It certainly aligns with the Climate Change Commission advice. So if we stay with the advice that they've been given, then this follows the budgets and pathways under the Climate Change Commission. So it is definitely the direction of travel, and so we're not expecting change, but then, we could be surprised.
You never, and that's fair. But and I guess the reflection I'd have would be this new government would like to perhaps legislate more than, say, support financially, which is a slightly different position from the previous government. So perhaps there's an argument that it could become even stronger for industry as well. So, cool. No, all good. Thank you very much. What about if, maybe for you, Dave, if lots of businesses have already got decarbonisation plans in place, how can an existing decarbonisation plan be utilised to transition that into a consent?
And they definitely can be. So it's not reinventing the wheel all the time. There are some specific requirements around, I guess, this emissions plan rather than some of the other things. And I guess lots of sites have done energy audits and decarb roadmaps and ETAs before. So it's really making sure that they are up to date and cover the exact requirements. And I guess, a good place to start is updating the capital costs and the energy prices, to those new rates. And as you find, they change all the time, so that needs to be fully up to date. And there are a few specific requirements, and one that springs to mind is doing an energy and mass balance for the site. So some sites might have that, but some sites might not as well. So then it's really just making sure you're ticking all the boxes, and then feeding it into those existing documents.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. Just add to that. Just one of our experience with one of our clients was that they've, when they've been asked about what they're doing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, they've pointed to their corporate targets and their, that they've got overall. They're looking at reducing their emissions footprint across their business, but this is very specific to the site, and you have to so having done that analysis at a corporate level is not enough in terms of the regulation. It has to be process and site specific in terms of what reductions you're putting in place on a particular site.
And,
So,
and if this, sorry, just to play on that a little further, we've got a question here around economic viability, and so I guess say over a 10-year consent, if that's the consent for an existing piece of equipment, who determines how hard industry has to go from an economic perspective? Is that the industry? Is it the SQP? Is it the council? Like where does that sort of, is there a tension between all three around action, say from an economic perspective? Where's that viability sit?
I guess the key thing around that viability is the NPV. So it's got to have a positive NPV. So that's, I guess, the metric that's typically used. And there are some guidance documents and calculation sheets that are being prepared as part of this, I guess, to help give information to people preparing these, which might have typical capital costs and energy rates and all those kind of things which go into that calculation. They are very general though, so it's a good guide, but then it's still very, very site specific. So I guess it's up to the site to go away and say, cool, actually our rates are going to be this into the future. And then as part of the document, say, look, yeah, you said the rate was going to be this, but we think it's going to be this, and here's the backup for it. So it's a combination of things, but everywhere's different around the country, and there are all these different things, and different organisations have different, average cost of capital factors and discount factors and all those kind of things. So that all gets built into it, and then also those specific energy rates and site-specific energy rates and capital costs.
Yeah, and can I just add to that the consenting tests are slightly different for new devices and existing devices. So new devices, you need to be able to show that there's no technically feasible, financially viable, lower emissions alternatives to your device. So it requires kind of working through what the options are. Are they technically feasible? So, I mean, you might be looking at biomass, for example. Is there enough fuel source? Are there maybe local restrictions on odor or anything like that? Whereas if you've got an existing device, you need to be able to show that you're implementing the best practicable option to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. So, and that might ultimately end up to be, if you've got a boiler that still has another 10-year lifespan, it might make more sense to keep operating that to the end of its lifespan. But in the meantime, you're doing more energy efficiency tasks and all that kind of stuff, and then at the end of the lifespan of that boiler, maybe that's when you'll be replacing it with something that's uses a different type of fuel, or so yeah, there's slightly different considerations.
And I guess on that point as well, incremental versus total costs as well. So if you've got a new site and your base solution is going to cost $1 million, but your low carbon is going to cost $2 million, effectively your low carbon solution is that incremental $1 million cost onto it. Whereas if you've got an existing site with a boiler, if you're replacing that boiler, then you have to stump up the entire capital cost to put a low carbon solution in.
For those businesses who've done a lot of work around efficiency previously, because I mean, look, energy efficiency's got a positive payback, right? And there's lots of businesses that have been forward thinking in this space, made some significant savings over a long period of time, but maybe that next step is too much to replace a piece of equipment. Can you get rewarded for previous effort, I guess, in this space? No,
so I guess that's always good to have that previous effort, but it's really about making the site as good as possible. So even if half the things have been done, if there's still half there to be done which are economic, then they should be done. If they're not economic, I guess that they don't need to be rolled into it. But it's always that ongoing assessment of what's happened with the energy rates. If they go up massively, then what becomes economic changes. So as part of the consent, it may be to look at things in 2, 5, 10 years time to say, actually, we're going to reassess that particular assessment of a heat pump or whatever it may be with the rates at the time. And if it's good, then we'll put it in. If it's not, then we'll hold off until a later time.
Sure.
I would also. Oh, sorry.
That's
I
okay.
would
Go.
also
Yeah.
add that yeah, with existing devices, that it does come down to what the BPO is at the time that you're applying for the consent, because the purpose of the emissions plan is to set out actions and methods to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions discharge from the activity. So, so long as you've got a BPO that shows that you're doing some reduction, the actual level of reduction will probably be site specific, and it might turn out that if you've already done a whole lot of stuff, your level of further reduction might be very minimal, versus a site that hasn't done a hell of a lot. Their level of reduction or their reduction targets might be a lot higher, and that's going to come down to what the site specific circumstances are.
Okay. Can I jump forward a little bit? Look, we've done some good work together on some of these consents so far. Dave and Tess, Luke, and Deborah were involved in those. Is there any particular learnings or anything you'd like to share around what went well, maybe what didn't go well, as we're sort of finding our way through this process in its early days?
Probably one of the big ones is engagement with council early. Is really, really important, and that really sets up the process. And I guess a good example is the definition of site-wide. So in general, it is everything, but there can be exceptions around that. So really having those upfront discussions with the council, so everyone's on the same page right from the get-go, rather than doing all the documentation and then submitting it, and they're like, well, that's not sufficient. And in our work with the councils, we've found them really, really, really good to deal with. Really pragmatic, quite open. They're learning as everyone is going along on this as well. So just working with them to get the best solution has been really good.
Yeah, and I guess for us, we've sort of noticed that for large sites and multinational firms, they will have a lot of energy efficiency and engineering in-house skills, and so it's a matter of kind of guiding those clients through the process to let them know what information they need, but they can then kind of provide it, and the likes of Deta can then check it, just to make sure that it is fit for purpose. When smaller sites will not have access to all that expertise, and so there's probably more of a need potentially to get someone like Deta on board to have a look at the energy efficiency on site and provide that alternative advice. We have kind of worked through some emissions plans with some clients, and the level of information that you need to be able to provide the evidence of the BPO is quite high, and you have to work with a lot of suppliers and gather information and have that evidential level to kind of demonstrate with the council how you arrived at where you've arrived at. So I guess that the process does actually take longer than you might think. The lead-in time could be quite significant for getting the required information for the level of assessment that's needed, but it will vary a bit at the moment. Everyone's on a bit of a learning curve across the regional councils. Hopefully the ECA guidance will provide some sort of levelling of that, and the information requirements are set out there, and obviously there's some helpful tools in that whole package that ECA's put together. But everyone is still on a learning curve with this. It's early days.
Yeah. No, good point. So obviously there's a fair bit to this, as I've kind of outlined, and there's going to be obligations on business, but there's also going to be costs to this legislation. So if we're going to start, or a new, think of a small, relatively simple business who hasn't had to go through a consent process at all for this particular activity previously, what's the process, and indicatively, what's it going to cost to get to the point where you've actually got a consent in place?
Yeah, so from the data side of things, I'll give you a classic consultant answer of it depends. Depends on kind of number of devices, fuel use, complexity, what you've done to date, all that good stuff. But indicatively, for a process heat order and development of a decarb plan, and our part of engaging with council, supporting the development led from PDP, like the number we talk to is between 15, 20 up to 60K. It really depends on the site. I know that's quite a big range to work with, but to give you an idea of scale.
Cool. Okay.
And then above and beyond that, there's obviously costs associated with engaging planners to support, and obviously with council application fees and that side of things as well.
Thank you. We've got a question here. We've used the word industry a lot through this presentation. Just for clarity, this legislation includes all fossil fuel consumption. The example we've been asked about is a hospital. That would still be in industrial use. So I just want to confirm that my understanding is the same as yours.
Yeah, so it doesn't cover space heating from my understanding. So someone like a hospital won't be using heat for anything other than space heating, so it's unlikely to apply here. Deborah, test jump in if my interpretation is incorrect.
Well, no, what I was going to say is that industrial process heat, so it's a device that's covered as a device that is used to produce industrial process heat. And the definition is thermal energy that's used in industrial processes. So, I mean, it all really comes down to what we would classify as an industrial process, but it does add including manufacturing and processing of raw materials. So, I mean, in that sense, you know, because we also had questions come up in the road testing about, for example, a crematorium. And I think that you need to have a think of, are you doing an industrial activity? And a part of that, are you manufacturing or processing raw materials? Like, are you producing something? But yeah, there is definitely a little bit of a grey line, I think.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And if I think about a hospital, yeah, you've got the space heating part, as you alluded to there, Luke, but thinking about sterilising and what have you, that's a little more perhaps grey than what the space heating piece might be. So anyway, I think these are good test cases that are going to be brought through over the next wee while, as legislation comes into effect in January. I think we've covered the legislation quite well, and we haven't got any other questions at this point, but I just wondered if we could have a quick conversation about other factors that may impact on economics. So, Dave, you answered earlier on around emissions plan. If you have an emissions plan already in place, we've got one that's already being done. We talked about reviewing that plan on a fairly regular basis. Maybe is there any commentary provided around what's changing in that space and what some of those, how some of those economics might be changing in a relatively short period of time?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, the big one at the moment is the price of natural gas. So that has gone up, massively the last year, and currently it's at record high levels. Where it will stay at that level is, unknown, but particularly for probably the next year or so is expected to be pretty high. And whilst I guess a lot of organisations won't be off their contracts yet, if they are and they're coming into this high cost environment, that instantly makes the operating a natural gas boiler a lot more expensive, makes other options cheaper, and also improves the efficiency costs, the paybacks of energy efficiency options. So that's the big one. Diesel happened diesel a couple of years ago as well, and capital costs are always changing as well. So things got a lot more expensive with COVID. They're starting to level out a bit, but these things are changing all the time.
Yeah, and I think that highlights the need, even without this legislation in place, having an emissions reduction plan which is regularly updated, so you understand the economics of the decisions on a regular basis, is really important. We have a question here which perhaps might fit in the grey area, to your point, Tess. In the group's opinion, would natural gas compressors apply in thermal energy used industrial processes? So my understanding of a natural gas compressor is something that's used on the natural gas pipeline and I guess repressurizing gas in that way. Any opinion from the group around that?
It doesn't sound like industrial process heat to me on the face value. I mean, I think it'd be you could have a discussion about it post this if someone wants to reach out. But yeah, in general, it doesn't sound like industrial. It's not an industrial site. It's not to produce industrial goods, so it wouldn't be included in this. It doesn't seem like it's the intention of the legislation anyway to include something like that.
That's a valid point. Yeah, as we said, lots of potential grey areas. We've got sorry.
I was going to say, just thinking about that, I guess depending on the site, as part of a an energy audit, I guess use of natural gas compressors or steam compressors or compressed air pumps, those kind of things, that would typically come under an energy audit kind of approach as well. So it might not be covered in, I guess, a heat device, but it might be covered in this other route, depending on the kind of site. But I guess, as you said, it's all very grey, so good to ask the questions.
While we're on the glass section, glass houses, heating those, that's an industrial process?
Yeah, specifically included heating for growing plants. So I guess that, you might say it's not manufacturing and processing of raw materials. So they have been very specific that growing plants is included. So all our greenhouses are captured.
Yeah, and I think we'll see a lot of greenhouses captured by this legislation. They tend to fall in that size that they previously didn't need a consent, but now do. That kind of 500 to 2 meg natural gas boiler. We see a lot of those out in industry, and they'll be under significant pressure from this.
Yeah, and we're seeing co-location so that greenhouses can use waste heat from other sites as a kind of I guess a step forward in technology, because well not technology necessarily, but just the approach to heating them so that we're using waste heat beneficially. That's kind of coming through in some of the work that we're doing.
Cool. We've got an observation rather than a question, but I guess I'll reflect on this a little bit. A representative of one of the electricity distribution companies has made note around the need to engage with the electricity system early. So we've talked about engaging with council early. One of the things we learned and the industry learned through the Giddy program, where lots of electrification was occurring within a relatively short period of time, was making sure that that capacity was there, and that capacity only comes from engaging with the electricity companies pretty quick, I guess, up front, and making sure that industry's investment matches with the electricity sector's investment. So if, as part of the emissions reduction plans, you are planning some form of electrification, be it a heat pump or electric boiler or similar, then do engage with the electricity network to ensure they have got capacity for you to plug in. The same, I guess, as we've said earlier on around some gas constraints. If you are thinking of new assets, make sure you can actually get access to that gas, especially over the next 18 to 24 months when all signs point to a shortening of the gas supply.
Yeah, what was it? 35% down or something on current production levels?
27.5% in the first 3 months of the year. Cool. Perfect. All right. Any more questions coming through? All right. Yes, there is another question. So there's quite a few. What triggers? Oh, yeah, this is a very good one. What triggers an end user to actually start these conversations? So they have to be proactive with the council. How active are councils being around starting to engage with, industrial process heat users in their regions to date with regards to this legislation?
We're not sure, and that's actually something that we thought we might follow up on shortly. We've got someone starting with us who's been in the Auckland Regional Council who has been working on these consents from the other side, and we thought we might get that person to engage with the rest of the councils just to see what they are doing, whether they're communicating this potential need for consent with permitted activity. If an activity is a permitted activity within a region, then it's not necessarily on the regional council's radar. So it's difficult for the regional council to know how many of these are out there. I know you guys have got access to a database, so and with your information provision that you've been sort of promoting, that may be the only way that people are getting this information at the moment. But we did think that we would check in with the councils just to see if they are working at the other end to try and let people know of the requirement coming up.
Is there going to be a grace period, do you think? So January 25 is when this is supposed to be in place. If it's not in place and people haven't got their back of house resolved, which I think, given here we are in May, there's a lot of work to do between now and then. I think that's kind of a realistic case. Maybe not using this legislation as an example, but perhaps others. Like where would council sit on supporting or enabling industry to continue to do what they do while getting this in place? What will the steps be from it's not going to be shut you down tomorrow, but what would the steps look like to help industry to comply?
I mean, I can't really speak for regional councils, having not worked within a regional council myself, but I would envision that if applicants have submitted an application and they're at least showing steps towards getting their consent, it's probably going to be a case-by-case basis. Ideally, everyone would have their consent by January 2025, but as you say, it can be a long, a lengthy process, especially if people are submitting and maybe haven't had the technical support that they need, and the regional councils need to work through them with, further information requests or finding the right people for them to work with. It can be quite lengthy. But yeah, I would like to think there might be some kind of grace period for those who are working really hard towards getting their consent.
Yeah. Anyone with asking for a new consent is being picked up already. So we've had a couple of conversations with clients who have gone to install a new natural gas boiler. They've gone to the council. The council said, actually, you need to comply with this legislation. So those ones are being picked up. And people rolling off existing air discharge consents and applying for new ones are also already part of the council processes, including this legislation now. So yeah, it's those ones that are currently operating as permitted activities that now need consent, which is the challenging one for region. But we're pushing this out as much as we can with our clients, and I think word and everyone's getting a bit more awareness of it. But yeah, it's going to be a bit of a challenge for New Zealand industry to get everyone on board with this in that next 6 months.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Reflecting a little bit on I talked at the start about the carrots and the sticks. Looking at where the GIDI funding went, it went to the larger end of town because people are aware of it and had the resources to throw at this to maximise utility. And I think it'll be similar in this case, where again the larger end of town who perhaps already have consents and have teams who can do this, they'll be covered, and again it'll be the smaller businesses or industries which will perhaps be a little slower. I have one other question here, just around some of the nuances around the consent. If currently no air discharge consent is required, but the plant itself exceeds the threshold of 500 tonnes, so I'm trying to think of what that example might be, but if essentially you're emitting 500 tonnes from the plant and is using process heat, do they need to comply with legislation, even if there's no air discharge consent required?
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the point, is that under the regional plan, that they probably won't require an air discharge consent, but now under this national direction, they will require their consent by January 2025.
Yeah, it's limited in scope, though, to greenhouse gases. Although we have had some queries come back from regional councils where the applicant has said, well, we've got this greenhouse gas, we're triggered for a consent. And then the council is now asking for supporting information as to how they comply with the permitted activity rule, which is going as far as having to model the discharges to air to show that they comply with the conditions of the permitted activity. I find that a little bit unusual, but that's the approach some councils seem to be applying. So while they're not just accepting, because they're now in conversation with an applicant about the greenhouse gas, they're actually also asking questions about the air discharge, even though, say, if the regional rule for air discharges is a 5 megawatt appliance is a permitted activity, they're now asking that they demonstrate compliance with the conditions of that permitted activity. I don't think all councils will be doing that, but some are. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Certainly adds complexity to the process, hence the need to engage with people who know what they're talking about to help you through that process. Perfect. Well, we've come to the end of the questions that we have here. Are there any other comments that the panelists would like to make that we haven't covered on or touched on throughout the session today, just while we give others an opportunity to ask questions before we close out?
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about it, but it's sometimes challenging to see this just as a compliance activity. So I know from talking to a lot of clients in this, it feels like another regulation or another compliance activity. People have to tick a box so they can keep doing what they do. What we really want to reinforce is that this has a lot of co-benefits for organizations. So we talk about gas prices, we talk about electricity prices. In general, being more efficient on site has really good paybacks. I mean, Dave, Jeff, you guys have been doing energy audits for 10, 15 years, 20 years. I mean, a lot of the time we'll find paybacks of projects under 3-4 years with like pretty good savings. So that's one side of things. The other thing is kind of a risk element to it. And we've talked about, sites and companies being prepared for the future in terms of what this climate change thing is, what this new energy market is like, and just having that plan and having those processes in place mean you're not going to kind of get to the end of your gas contract and find out that gas prices are much higher or you don't have gas at all. And just, it's a risk mitigation step as well for organizations, not just compliance.
All right. Well, there's one more question, I think. It's a comment. It's a comment about the ECA guidance. So we'll ask this question because I think this is interesting. So according to this question asker, the ECA guidance is more demanding than the legislation. So if a business meets the requirements of the legislation but not the ECA guidance, is that likely to be accepted by councils? And is that where an endorsement of an SQP may help?
Yeah, so I think under the legislation, if you're in that mid 500 to 2,000 range, your emissions plan doesn't need to be approved by an SQP. And so I think in that situation, I would envision that councils would rely quite heavily on the guidance to understand what kind of needs to be within the emissions plan to meet the requirements of the legislation. And obviously the emissions plan the guidance is quite complex, and obviously that'll be scaled depending on the size of your activity and the range of different options that might be available. But I think, ones that are the high emission sites that need to be approved by an SQP, I would anticipate the councils would probably rely quite heavily on the advice of that SQP, and they themselves might not look so much through the emissions plan guidance. That's kind of my view on how councils might take it. But obviously, it'll be different for every council, probably.
Yeah, it's interpretation of the legislation which becomes complex, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool, perfect. Well, look, it's almost 12 o'clock. We might call an end to the conversation there. Many thanks to you, Dave, Luke, Tess and Deborah for your time today and your expertise contributing to the conversation. We really appreciate your insights. Many thanks for coming along and attending the webinar today to all of you attendees. As I said at the start, this will be made available, the recording for download. So please feel free to refer back to this or share this as you see fit with others in your organisation or within your peer group. Many thanks and have a great day.